Quite a tragic day, as we all obviously know. Do you want me to relieve you a few minutes here? We're going to stay on the air, certainly, until all of this is... We do have some word here as to what has... where some of the members of the Kennedy family were at the time of the event in Dallas, the assassination. Bob Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General of the United States, we are told was at lunch at the time it happened at his home in McLean, Virginia. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover called the FBI office in Dallas and ordered an all-out investigation of the shooting, which, of course, could be expected. President Kennedy, as you have been told now, was the first president to be assassinated since William McKinley was shot to death in 1901. 6 members of the Kennedy cabinet, as you also, I believe, have been told during the day, were out of the country on their way to Japan. Their plane was called back an hour and a half out of Honolulu. They're expected, of course, to return immediately to Washington. It is anticipated that the new President of the United States, the 36th President of the United States, Lyndon Baines Johnson, will continue the President Kennedy's policies with which he seemed to be in firm agreement during these 3 years of the Kennedy administration, and presumably will continue most of the cabinet in office through this next year, at least until the November elections. We told you that Senator Robert Kennedy was at his home in McLean, Virginia, when he got the word. Senator Ted Kennedy and his wife, Joan, are now leaving Washington. They're boarding a jet at Andrews Air Force Base destined for Hyannisport to be with the president's mother and father, who got the news there from a workman around the house who came running to the lawn where Mr. Kennedy was resting with the news of the assassination. The new President of the United States, we believe that he must have by now taken the oath of office, although we have not been advised of this yet, is Lyndon Baines Johnson, a native of Texas, of Johnson City, Texas, where his mother and father had a ranch. He was born there some 54 years ago. He was interested in politics at an early day when he was still in Southwest Texas State Teachers College. He took law later and became a very early follower of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who who became interested in the young man when he went to Congress in in the early days, 1937, of the Roosevelt second term, and Mr. Roosevelt had indeed sponsored him for that job after making him National Youth Administrator in Texas. CBS News correspondent Dan Rather has arrived in our KRLD studio in Dallas. Let's switch now to Dallas for his story.
The whereabouts of Lyndon Baines Johnson at the moment are unknown. Vice President, either soon to be or already President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson was at the Parkland Hospital in Dallas at the time or near the time of the official announcement of the death of the 35th President of this country, John F. Kennedy. Mr. Johnson left the hospital a very short time after 1 o'clock Central Standard Time. That would be 2 o'clock in New York. The Secret Service at this moment, or as of a few moments ago, was saying that Mr. Johnson's whereabouts would not be revealed for security reasons. Most, if not all, of the federal district judges of Dallas and surrounding counties were in and around the motorcade at the time the shooting occurred. We are told that most of the district judges went to Parkland Hospital. It is possible, we are told, that Lyndon Johnson was sworn in some kind of temporary ceremony at the hospital. However, there is no confirmation on that. The fact is, at the moment, the whereabouts of Lyndon Johnson are unknown, the Secret Service says, for security reasons. Mrs. John F. Kennedy left the hospital at approximately the same time the coffin carrying the body of her husband left. The coffin went to a private air installation at Dallas's Love Field. It either has left or will leave Dallas Love Field in a matter of minutes. We are told that the gunshot wound, the fatal wound inflicted on the President of the United States, entered at the base of the throat and came out at the base of the neck on the back side. CBS News correspondent Bob Pierpoint has been at the Parkland Hospital here in Dallas from just a few moments after the time President Kennedy arrived at the hospital and Governor John Connally arrived at the hospital. We expect to have Bob Pierpoint in the studio here with us very shortly. A briefing session for newsmen is anticipated at Parkland Hospital at any moment. Pierre Salinger, the presidential press secretary, presumably will preside over that briefing session. We hope to bring you that briefing session either live from the hospital or on film. At that time, a good deal of the confusion about exactly what happened along the motorcade route here in Dallas at the time President Kennedy was shot and killed should be cleared up. That briefing session we expect to have in a few minutes. Also on the air very shortly, we are hopeful of having some film taken at the Dallas airport at the time of President Kennedy's arrival. Also, CBS News cameraman from Washington, Tommy Cravens, was in the motorcade less than 50 yards from President Kennedy when the shooting occurred. Cameraman Cravens' film is on the premises at this time, being processed. We hope to have that film for you very shortly. What it will show, Cameraman Cravens was not at all certain. There is some confusion as to whether a Secret Service man also was killed at the time of the shooting. There has been no official confirmation of any Secret Service man being killed, although there are widespread reports, including one from the Dallas Police Department, that a Secret Service man was killed at the same time President Kennedy and Texas Governor John Connally were shot. The latest word from the hospital on Texas Governor Connally was that Governor Connally was in the operating room and had been seriously, if not critically wounded. That was the last official word that we had from the Dallas Parkland Hospital. As you may know by this time, President Kennedy was shot as he took part in a motorcade which was driving him to the Dallas Trade Mart, which is a big meeting center located just a short way from downtown Dallas. The announcement that the president had been shot was not made at that meeting center until approximately a half hour after the president arrived at the hospital. There was a great deal of grief immediately at the center. There was a great deal of disbelief. In fact, switchboards all over Dallas at anything resembling a public information source are still completely swamped with callers who apparently refuse to believe that John F. Kennedy has been shot and killed. There have been a number of suspects arrested by Dallas police, Dallas County Sheriff's officers. One of the suspects was a 25-year-old white youth. He was the first one arrested. He was in the vicinity of a multi-story building near the scene where President Kennedy and Texas Governor Connally were shot. On the 4th or 5th floor, it has never been completely determined on which floor, of that building, 4 empty cartridges were found. Police immediately ringed that building. They also ringed a 3 or 4 block area around that building, believing that the assassin had fired his shots from the building. A 25-year-old white man was arrested either in or near that building and taken to the Dallas County Sheriff's Office as a suspect. However, our latest report from the Sheriff's Office is that 25-year-old man is not considered a good suspect. Just a short while ago, near a downtown Dallas theater, a 30-year-old white man was arrested. He had on his person a weapon. At this time, we are not exactly certain as to what kind of weapon it was. It has been reported that a .30 caliber weapon was the one used to kill President Kennedy and to wound Governor Connally. That has not been confirmed. Whether or not the man arrested a few minutes ago at a downtown Dallas theater had on his person a .30 weapon has not yet been confirmed. But the fact is that a 30-year-old white man, meeting the description of one for whom an all points alert was put out shortly after the shooting, has been taken into custody in downtown Dallas. In just a moment, we hope to have the films from the shooting scene just after the shooting occurred by CBS cameraman Tommy Cravens. But while we see if that film is ready and can be shown to you, let's switch back to CBS News headquarters in New York.
There is considerable controversy that has gone on over a good number of years that is going to come up again now under tragic circumstances as to what number should be given to the new President of the United States, Lyndon Baines Johnson, whether he is the 36th or the 37th President of the United States, even as it was debated whether President Kennedy is properly the 35th or the 36th President. This all stems from the fact that Grover Cleveland served split terms as President of the United States. Mr. President Truman called himself the 34th President of the United States, and President Kennedy called himself the 35th, both believing that Grover Cleveland's two non-consecutive terms should be counted as one in counting the number of presidents, and not the total terms should be counted. So on that basis, presumably, President Lyndon Baines Johnson will consider himself the 36th President of the United States. We still, quite oddly it seems to me on this news desk, have had no word from Dallas at all as to the location of Mr. Johnson, nor as to whether or not he has indeed taken the oath of office. It is assumed that he would have from a Dallas judge, a federal judge perhaps then deciding to have another ceremony in Washington with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, which was what Calvin Coolidge did when he learned that he had become the President of the United States on his Vermont farm. It seems almost inconceivable that this whole tragic set of circumstances has taken place in these last 3 hours only. It was 12:25 Eastern Standard Time, 11:25 in Dallas, when the shots rang out on that Dallas street, and the life of President Kennedy was snuffed out. We now learn that Vice President Johnson is expected to be sworn in as president aboard an airliner before flying back to the nation's capital. The White House says that Mrs. Kennedy will return to Washington late today to be with the children, Caroline 6 and John Jr., who will be 3 next week. We have word from Dr. Malcolm Perry, the attendant surgeon at Parkland Hospital who attended President Kennedy, who says that when he arrived at the emergency room, I noticed the president was in critical condition with a wound of the neck and head. When asked if possibly the wounds could have been made by 2 bullets, he said that he did not know. He said that immediate presumptive measures were taken, and Dr. Kemp Clark, the chief of neurosurgery, was called along with several other members of the staff. Dr. Perry says they arrived immediately, but at this point the president's condition was critical and moribund. A tracheotomy was performed to assist the president's breathing. That's a throat operation. The doctor said an oxygen machine was used, and blood and fluid also were administered. All of this, obviously, to no avail. The president died 25 minutes after the shooting at 1 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. Shortly after the news of the president's death, CBS News correspondent Bernard Eisman went out into the streets of New York, and here is his report.
As the news of President Kennedy's death spread through the city, to those who hadn't heard it or had heard only the first fragmentary reports, even this street, which is normally so loud you can't hear yourself talking to another person, acquired a stillness that it's never known. Wherever there was a radio or a television set, people gathered to listen. Can you tell me what your first reaction was, ma'am, when you...
Tragedy that ever happened to this country since President Lincoln.
How about you, sir?
I couldn't believe it, that's all. I just couldn't believe it.
And you, sir? What was your...
I didn't believe it.
Who do you think would do something like this?
I don't know. I can imagine in a way. I can imagine.
How about you, sir?
Well, I feel very bad, that's all I can say.
Can you imagine who would do something like this, sir?
Well, I don't think anybody in their right mind. I think this is a terrible thing for our country, not only for our country, but for the entire world. I mean, after all, one does realize that we are striving for peace at the present time, and a thing like this, well, it's just an utter tragedy.
You, sir, do you think that this indicates some sort of an illness in America today?
I don't understand so much, sir.
Thank you very much. Have you been thinking about what's happened in the last few hours, sir?
Yes, I have, and I'm deeply shocked. I'm ashamed this sort of thing can happen in America.
And how about you, sir? Have you had any... What are your first reactions to a tragedy of this sort?
My first reaction, sir, is that I hope these Southerners, these radicals, have satisfied they got their pound of flesh, and killing a man as good as that.
Are you certain that it is right-wing radicals or people who oppose the president so desperately that they would do something like this, who committed this act?
Yes, sir. Could be no one else. Someone who do this must be mentally deranged. No clear-thinking human person would ever think of doing something like that.
How about you, sir? What was your first reaction?
Well, my first reaction was I was terribly shocked. I couldn't believe that it really happened. But I disagree with this man about it being a right-wing radical. It could have been communist, I think, probably something like that.
And how about you, ma'am? What?
We were all crying in my place, all crying.
You look as though you've been crying. Is that how it struck you first?
Yes.
How did you hear about it?
Well, we got radio in my place and they told us.
Did all of the people in the office cry?
Yes.
And the office then was let go and sent home?
Yes.
And how about you, sir? What reaction do you have? How do you feel after a thing like this has happened?
Disgust. Really.
Disgust with...
We have the first films taken in the motorcade just after the assassination shots were heard. Dan Rather has that story in Dallas, Texas.
We are now going to run the films which were taken first at the Dallas airport. These are the films of then Vice President Lyndon Johnson and his wife, Lady Bird Johnson, at the Dallas International Airport as they arrived this morning from Fort Worth. Here is the late President John F. Kennedy and Mrs. Kennedy coming down the ramp at the Dallas airport. These films were taken slightly less than an hour and a half before President Kennedy was shot and killed in a motorcade in downtown Dallas. The usual receiving line, of course, a number of Dallas dignitaries and a lady who said that she had waited for 69 years to meet a president. Mrs. Kennedy had been given a bouquet of roses at the Dallas International Airport as a token of affection from the city of Dallas. President Kennedy had looked particularly hale and hearty on this Texas trip. We saw him Monday in Florida, and a number of the White House reporters remarked that he was looking more physically fit than he had at any time over the past year and a half or 2 years. This is part of the motorcade from the Dallas airport toward the downtown area. Shots taken just before the shooting occurred. This is Dallas's Parkland Hospital, where President Kennedy was taken after being mortally wounded. The president reportedly was alive when he reached the hospital, but he died a short time after arriving at the hospital. Some efforts were made when the presidential party first arrived at the hospital to keep pictures from being taken. The roses that Mrs. Kennedy had carried earlier were on the back seat of the automobile in which the president was shot. Now, these are scenes at a building across the street from the scene where President Kennedy was shot. Police immediately ringed this building. It's believed that the assassin was in this same building on either the 4th or 5th floor. Some empty cartridges have been found in that building. Witnesses said they believe 3 or 4 shots were fired. 4 empty cartridges were found in the building, which had been ringed by police. A number of suspects were picked up immediately. Practically anyone in the area who even gave a hint of looking suspicious was picked up. Considerable confusion in the immediate vicinity. Right there was the spot where the president was shot. This is part of the police contingent arriving to surround the building. Police thought they might be able to catch the assassin still in the building. They were unsuccessful in that. Police were heavily armed. They ringed not only the building, but about a 3-block area around this building, which, as I say, is located directly across from where the president was shot. This is practically the spot on the street where the president was shot. These pictures were taken just after the president had been taken to a hospital. Police made a systematic search of the building. They found no weapon. Up there on the 4th or 5th floor, perhaps out of one of those open windows, is where the assassin of President Kennedy is believed to have fired the fatal shots. We have no further information as yet from the hospital on the condition of Texas Governor John Connally, who was riding with President Kennedy and who also was critically wounded. Our last report from Parkland Hospital was that Governor Connally was in the operating room, that he was still alive but was in critical condition. Walter, you mentioned a short while ago that it was difficult to understand why we had not been appraised of the whereabouts of Lyndon Johnson, who will, of course, step up to the presidency in light of the tragic death today of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. We are in direct contact with Parkland Hospital. We're also in direct contact with Dallas Police and the FBI. We have a reporter with the Secret Service agents, and the word from all sources is that Mr. Johnson, his whereabouts are being kept secret for security reasons. If anyone knows where Mr. Johnson is, it is not us at this moment.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Dan. As a matter of fact, we just got the word from our reporters out there at the airport, bypassing you just as you were on the air at that last moment, that Lyndon B. Johnson has been sworn in as the President of the United States. He was sworn in at 1:38 Central Standard Time. That was 2:38, and that's almost an hour and a half ago now, if this time is correct here. The oath was administered to him by U.S. District Judge Sarah T. Hughes. He took the oath aboard the presidential plane at Love Field just prior to takeoff to return to Washington. The president's body is to be returned to Washington also, along with Mrs. Kennedy. She will accompany it, and that plane is supposed to arrive back at Andrews Air Force Base, we're told now, at 5:25 this afternoon, Eastern Standard Time. That's about an hour and a half from now. Whether that is the same plane in which now President Johnson is returning, we do not know. The presidential oath as Lyndon Baines Johnson, the 36th President of the United States, took it, reads, "I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will do the best of my ability to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States." And now President Johnson is flying back to Washington to actively take over the reins of government. 6 of President Kennedy's cabinet who were on the route to Japan have turned around at mid-ocean and are flying back to Washington. Attorney General Robert Kennedy, the president's younger brother, who was often mentioned as a possible candidate himself someday for the highest office of the land, is in Washington. So was Senator Ted Kennedy, his youngest brother. He was on the floor of the Senate, presiding. As a matter of fact, in the Senate, as the word came, he dashed from the Senate and is now en route to Hyannisport, Massachusetts, to be with his and the late president's mother and father there. We understand that the president's sister, Mrs. Sergeant Shriver, wife of the administrator of the Peace Corps, was flying away from Washington too, and the first thought was that she perhaps was going to Texas to be with her brother before she learned of his death. We do not know where she is now destined. We will now pause for 10 seconds so that our stations may identify themselves.
Is Channel 2.
The assassination of President Kennedy has been reported, of course, in some detail here since the historic shots rang out in the streets of Dallas, Texas at 12:25 noon today. It seems barely possible that that was just some 3.5 hours ago. The president lived for 35 minutes after being rushed to Parkland Hospital in Dallas. He died there at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, at noon Dallas time today. The 36th President of the United States, Lyndon Baines Johnson, 54-year-old native of Texas, a former senator, former member of Congress, former administrator of the National Youth Administration under President Roosevelt in Texas, has taken the oath of office aboard an airplane at Love Field in Dallas and is en route back to Washington. The president's body is flying back to Washington also, accompanied by Mrs. Kennedy. The president's wife was in the open limousine along with Governor Connolly of Texas and his wife when the shots were fired from an assassin's rifle in apparently the 4th or 5th floor of a building overlooking the motorcade route that was taking the president from Dallas Airport to downtown Dallas for a speech at noon. The president was hit in the head and the neck. Whether by one bullet, however, or two has not been clarified. Governor Connolly was hit in the chest. Mrs. Kennedy and Mrs. Connolly were not hit by the bullets. A report that a Secret Service man was killed has not been clarified either. In Dallas, a Dallas policeman just a short while ago was shot and killed while chasing a suspected to the assassination in a Dallas theater. The man pulled a gun, shot one policeman, wounded another, but was captured. And when he was captured, he yelled, "It's all over now," and screaming hysterically was taken into custody by the police. Of course, we have no information whether this man is the assassin or not. A vast dragnet has gone out throughout the Dallas area for any possible suspects to the criminal act in Dallas today. Former presidents of the United States, Truman, Hoover, and Eisenhower, as far as we know, have all been informed at Independence, Kansas. Mrs. Truman said that President Truman was too shaken up to make any comment at the moment. We have not heard from former President Hoover, who is at the Waldorf Tower suite in which he lives, but has made no comment as yet. Former President Dwight David Eisenhower also is in New York, and his statement is this: "I share the sense of shock and dismay that all Americans feel at the despicable act that resulted in the death of our nation's president. Mrs. Eisenhower and I also join with all other citizens in expressing our personal grief and prayerful concern to Mrs. Kennedy and all other members of the family." That statement from former President Eisenhower. In Boston, Massachusetts, the late president's home, Richard Cardinal Cushing, a lifelong friend of the Kennedy family, made plans to leave immediately for Hyannisport to be with Mr. Joseph P. Kennedy and the president's mother, Mrs. Rose Kennedy. The cardinal officiated at the marriage of President Kennedy and Jacqueline Kennedy in 1953. It will be a particularly poignant time for the Kennedy family next week. The two Kennedy children both have birthdays next week. John, 3, November the 25th, and Caroline, 6, on November the 27th. An entire nation has almost come to a stop today in the wake of the horrible news. The stock market, after getting the first news before it was known that the president had died, prices began to plummet, and the New York Stock Exchange and all other commodity and stock exchanges across the country closed. In New York, all the theaters were immediately darkened and will not open tonight. Schools were let out across the country. We reported to you on the arrest of that individual in Dallas. He is being grilled now. He's said to be 24 years old. A name has been given for him by Dallas police as Leo H. Oswald, although, as the Dallas police themselves say, there is no information as yet that he is the assassin. He was being chased as a possible suspect, however, when he did pull a gun, and he killed a Dallas policeman at that moment. A tragic day in the city. We still haven't heard definitely whether a Secret Service man died in the fusillade of shots. That was the rumor, but rumors do spread rapidly at a time like this, and there's no proof that that actually took place as yet. We learn now that definitely Mrs. Lyndon Baines Johnson, the new First Lady, and Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy are accompanying President Johnson back to Washington in the presidential plane. They left Dallas just a short while ago. They're due back in Washington at approximately 5:30, we are told, at which time President Johnson will have to take into his hands the reins of the most powerful nation in the world. President Johnson, as you know, is 54 years old, native of Texas, of a city called Johnson City, Texas, which is a little bit west of Austin, Texas, where Mrs. Johnson has radio and television interests, our affiliate station there. She has other television radio stations in Texas. President Johnson has been interested in politics since he was a Southwest Texas State Teachers College. He studied law. He went to Congress in 1937 after having served as National Youth Administrator in Dallas under President Roosevelt. He was a favorite of President Roosevelt's, was a New Dealer in the early days of the New Deal, although his politics had turned somewhat more conservative over the recent years. He had sought the presidential nomination that was won by President Kennedy, and was probably had about as good a chance as any of the runners-up when President Kennedy, then a senator from Massachusetts, swept the Democratic Convention in Los Angeles in 1960. It was a surprise when President Kennedy announced that Lyndon Johnson was his choice for vice president, and it was thought that he brought him into the ticket primarily to help swing a recalcitrant South, including the rather important state with a heavy electoral vote, the state of Texas. It was in Texas today where President Kennedy, after 3 years of that administration, met his death. Eric Severide has just moved in. Eric, do you have a word or two?
Walter, I thought perhaps that we might talk a little about the new President of the United States. I've been trying to put down a few notes about the life and the nature of Lyndon Baines Johnson, the man that our thoughts will be upon very soon. He is 55, Walter, not 54. He was born in August of 1908. He's really in the prime of life for the responsibilities of the presidency, at a point where a man's experience and his energies meet at a rather high mutual level. He was born in Texas, near that hamlet called Johnson City, and the family flag flies there over the LBJ Ranch. He is a lawyer by education, a politician by instinct, and by great success. He was a very young aide to President Roosevelt during the New Deal days, working on youth projects. He first went to the House of Representatives in 1937 when he was only 29 years old, and he became the protege of Sam Rayburn, the great Texan who ran the House as Speaker longer than any man in our history, including Henry Clay. Johnson went to the Senate in 1949. He won in Texas by a very tiny majority vote of 87, actually, and he became without much doubt the most effective majority leader in the history of the Senate. His energy was prodigious. He lived always in a whirl of activity, and he put most senators in his personal debt by one service or another. His fame in Washington itself became very great during those Eisenhower years when he led the opposition majority in the Senate, and his power at that time was considerably greater than it was, his real political power, than in these years when he has been the vice president. Johnson has been called by some a liberal by conviction and intellect, a conservative by geography. His political alliances in Texas were with the more conservative Texas Democrats who have managed the state for a good many years. But in most national matters, he was always regarded as what we call a progressive, including on the issue of civil rights. And this again was in the pattern and the image of his protege, Sam Rayburn. He is a fairly wealthy man. The family holdings, some in the name of his wife, Lady Bird, include television stations as well as that family ranch. In 1955, when Mr. Johnson was making a Sunday visit to the farm of George McGee, another Texan, now an ambassador, that was near Washington, Johnson was hit rather hard with a heart attack. He thought at first it was only acute indigestion. Senator Clinton Anderson of New Mexico was there at the time for this luncheon, and he said at once, "You have had a heart attack." Johnson was taken to a hospital, and he slowly recovered. For some time after that, his strength was considerably diminished. I remember him telling reporters once that on Monday morning he said, "I'm full of energy. By Wednesday night, I'm tired out." But all that changed. His full strength came back, and in recent years he has demonstrated his old energies, and they're great energies, in a daily whirl of activities, including a good many trips around this country and abroad. He is now personally acquainted with all the world leaders that the President was acquainted with, including Mr. Khrushchev. And his grasp of domestic politics, of course, is quite profound at the general and intellectual level, as well as the practical working level of the total human machinery that makes our rather cumbrous system work. His fierce fight against Kennedy for the nomination in 1960 now seems only yesterday to most of us. His great prestige in Washington itself was not at that time matched by his prestige and his fame in the country at large. This was a great struggle right down to those final hours in the convention. And then Mr. Kennedy chose Johnson to be his running mate, partly because he had to have the South. And Johnson was regarded as the one man who could conciliate the Southern conservatives, and this he did. And there were some who said later that Mr. Kennedy really owed his election to Lyndon Johnson. In any case, Johnson has never shown any jealousy whatsoever, any kind of bitterness. He became the President's lieutenant in full fidelity, in private as well as in public. But as vice presidents do, certainly under a very energetic and active president, he slowly faded from national consciousness. And when the president died today, he and Mr. Kennedy were the president and the vice president were engaged behind the scenes in Texas in trying to settle a rather fierce feud within the Texas Democratic Party between the Johnson-Connally forces and the liberal groups led by Senator Ralph Yarborough. All that, of course, now seems petty and of no consequence in retrospect. It doesn't matter. Mr. Johnson is the president, and Texas will be his personal political base in toto. And when the sorrow of today begins to fade, when the president has been laid to rest, the machinery of the national government will take up again, and again Americans will have to think ahead, not only to what lines of policy and action the new president will follow, but of course also to the election of next year. Mr. Johnson will be nominated next August at the Democratic Convention if he wishes it, and I'm sure most observers would predict now that he will wish it. All estimations on the outcome of that election next November, of course, are now rather without meaning. The election, like the course of this great country itself, now lies with fate and the continuing nature of our times and in our world. And now back, Walter, to you.
Eric, that matter that you suggested a little earlier on this afternoon of the danger of a violent reaction to the right wing in America, assessing very probably improperly the assassination as being the responsibility resting there already is beginning to come to light. You saw perhaps, maybe you were busy.
I missed that, Walter.
Well, there's some interviews in the streets of New York, and 2 or 3 people were laying the blame right there.
It's much too early for that sort of thing.
Oh, of course it is. The Soviet Union, however, is doing that. TOSS has announced that extreme right-wing elements were undoubtedly to blame.
This will be tragic if anything of this court either takes possession of people's minds, particularly if there's any truth in it.
Right. We now have some new film in at our Washington Bureau, so let's switch back to Washington now and Neil Strauser.
Washington, Walter, is still in a state of shock, except for those departments responsible for seeing to the smooth transition of the presidency from Mr. Kennedy to Mr. Johnson. Almost no work is being done. Most federal and District of Columbia workers are being sent home an hour early. On Capitol Hill, almost all of the comments contain the words tragic loss, disastrous. First word of the shooting was carried to the Senate floor by Richard Rydell, a press liaison aide whose job it is to watch the tickers in the Senate cloakroom and keep senators up to date on world happenings. Rydell tells of his fateful mission.
Well, the routine, the tickers in the lobby, AP and UP tickers, are read by senators and staff members for routine information. Phyllis Rock of the staff of Senator Morse of Oregon was in the lobby by herself reading the ticker. She turned to one of my assistants, Tom Pelican, who is with Senator Long of Missouri in his office part of the time, and said the president has been shot. Tom rushed out to tell me. I immediately went into the Senate chamber in front of the desk of Majority Leader Senator Mike Mansfield, raised my voice so that he and the senators at the surrounding desks could hear, and said, "Senators, the president has been shot." It, of course, was like a shock wave, a jolt. I crossed the aisle to the Republican side, where Senator Dirksen was seated, and in the same manner told Senator Dirksen and the Republican senators who were at adjacent desks, with, of course, the same shocked reaction and stunned expression on their faces. I then happened to recall that a few moments before, the president's brother, Senator Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts, was presiding over the Senate. I turned and he was still occupying the chair. I knew that someone would have to inform him. And I thought I might as well. It was a very difficult job because of the family relationship as well as the friendship of the senators to the president. I rushed up to the chair and said, Senator Kennedy, your brother, the president, has been shot." He gave a jerk to his body tensed, but he was absolutely calm. And as I recall, Senator Kennedy, then presiding over the Senate, when he heard this awful news, said no. And that was all. In an orderly manner, he gathered up the papers on his desk that his routine office work that he brings when he presides over the Senate, so that he can conserve the time, the long hours presiding over the Senate by working at his office work. I walked off the rostrum with him with my arm around Senator Kennedy, patting his shoulders, and said, "Senator, if there's anything any of us can do, let us know. My own suggestion would be that you contact the Air Force and have them rush you out to Texas to your brother's side in a military jet." He said, "Thank you. I'm going to call the White House and the Attorney General." Whereupon, by that time, we had reached a phone in the lobby, and he immediately put in calls to the White House and to the Department of Justice, seeking all the information and contact with his brother, a good friend, Bobby Kennedy.
Of course, that trip to Dallas, Texas proved unnecessary. Senator Edward Kennedy and his sister Eunice Shriver later this afternoon flew red-eyed and somber to Hyannisport, Massachusetts to be with their parents. The late president's youngest brother and his sister, the wife of the Peace Corps director, arrived at Andrews Air Force Base at 3:20 p.m. by helicopter and within minutes had boarded a jet for Cape Cod to be with the ailing former Ambassador Joseph Kennedy and Mrs. Rose Kennedy. This is Neil Strasser in Washington. And now let's switch back to Dallas, Texas, where Dan Rather is standing by. Dan?
Walter, we have some additional film taken at and near Parkland Hospital, where President John Kennedy died. This film is in rough cut form. These are some of the witnesses in the area of the shooting. There was a great deal of disbelief at first that the president had even been shot, and even more disbelief that he was dead. This is in the area of the emergency room of the hospital, I believe. We have Eddie Barker, news director of KRLD Television and Radio, our affiliate in Dallas. Eddie, this is near the emergency room of the hospital, is it not?
Yes, Dan, that is correct, and that's a Secret Service agent there who is talking to the crowd. We talked to some people who we would consider as very good sources. This is when they were getting ready to leave the hospital, and it was very difficult to get any film because Secret Service agents were quite adamant in keeping everyone back a good distance from. This is Senator Yarborough here, I believe.
Senator Yarborough was one of the first to get the word of the president's death.
Right.
He is a Democrat of Texas, Senator Ralph Yarborough.
Right. This is Father Huber from Holy Trinity Church in Dallas, who administered the last rites to the president. There were two priests in attendance, and I do not know the other one's name at this time. There were shocked people all around, as you can see from these crowds, many of them hospital employees.
Quite a large crowd gathered at the hospital.
Yes. There was quite a traffic jam out there.
These scenes are at Parkland Hospital
That's
in
correct.
Dallas, where President John Kennedy died.
Dan, I don't know whether you are aware of this or not. Mrs. Kennedy maintained her composure, we understand, up until the time that she actually went into the room where the president's body lay, and she said, "Jack, Jack, no, no," was the words that she used. She rode from the hospital to the airport in the back section of the hearse. It was a cream-colored hearse belonging to a local funeral home here. The curtains were drawn, but as the hearse left, Mrs. Kennedy could be seen in the back. And the president's body was airborne at 47 minutes past 2 o'clock.
At Central
Texas
Standard Time.
Yes.
We covered Mrs. Kennedy yesterday in San Antonio as she arrived with her husband and the Lyndon Johnsons. There had been some reports from the White House press corps that Mrs. Kennedy was reluctant to make the Texas trip. It had been billed in many quarters as strictly a political trip, and as Mrs. Kennedy arrived in San Antonio, she at first appeared to be rather ill at ease, but later in the day she seemed to warm up to the occasion, and I noticed today in both Fort Worth and Dallas that she really seemed to be enjoying herself. I think with Mrs. Kennedy there was some reluctance to come to the state because people would tell her, well, they're a different kind of people. But she did seem to be enjoying herself thoroughly throughout the day. Eyewitnesses at the shooting say that in the early moments, immediately after the shooting, that the president's head was in Mrs. Kennedy's lap, and that Mrs. Kennedy did restrain herself, did have her composure until the time she went to the hospital where the president, then dead, was.
She walked out of the hospital, Dan, under her own power. There was no one, from where we were standing, there was no one holding on to her arm. She walked out. She was hatless when she came out of the emergency exit and got into the hearse that bore the body to the airport.
Eddie, a lot of questions are going to be asked about what kind of place is Dallas, Texas. Just recently there was the publicity about the city and the rough reception that the United States ambassador to the United Nations, Adlai Stevenson, got here. There was the occasion in which he was spat upon and hit with a picket sign. I think Mayor Cabell only yesterday made a statement saying that the city was quite anxious to give President Kennedy an especially warm welcome because of that incident. But there are going to be a lot of questions asked in the coming days about what kind of place is Dallas, Texas, a place in which this could happen. You're a long-time resident here, and in the eyes of many, sort of Mr. Dallas. Could you tell us what kind of place this is?
Dan, it's actually it's a very fine place, and it's a very fine city, and I know the city fathers have discussed this at great length. There is an element that has developed here in the past few years that considers itself a wing very much to the right, to the far right, and this is certainly a very small minority. I know today at the luncheon that the president was to have attended, and we were looking over the people who were there, and there were many Republicans, there were many conservative Democrats, but they were all out to welcome and honor the office of the President of the United States. And this is something that certainly this city is going to be living with for a long time, but this does not in any way reflect the great majority of the people here. Politics in this town are different, certainly, than they are in a lot of places. There are many factions of the Democratic Party. The Republican Party, as you know, is very strong. We have a Republican congressman. We had a situation here a few years back. You may remember when Senator Johnson had his, then Senator Johnson had his problems in one of the downtown hotels.
That was in the 1960 campaign.
Yes, but this is a minority group, and certainly is not a reflection of this community. Many of these leaders, I'll say in closing, when the word came today at the Trade Mart that the president was dead, they broke down and cried. It was a very moving thing.
We're going to switch now from Dallas, Texas, back to CBS News headquarters in New York.
The news, as you know it, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas today. 12:25, he was shot in a motorcade en route to a speech in Dallas from the Dallas airport and died 35 minutes later. Lyndon Baines Johnson, 55-year-old vice president, took the oath of office in an airplane at Love Field and is flying back to Washington to take the reins of government. Governor John Connally of Texas was shot also and is in serious condition at the Parkland Hospital in Dallas. Charles Collingwood, if you want to come in and relieve me a little while, we are here at CBS News going to stay on the air throughout this day to bring you details as we have them. That presidential plane is expected back in Washington now, we're told, at 6:05 with the president's body. Charles?
As Walter Cronkite has told you, the vice president, the former vice president, the 36th president of the United States, Lyndon Baines Johnson, is on his way back to Washington after having been sworn in the executive compartment of the same plane which brought President Kennedy to Dallas, Texas this morning. President Johnson was sworn in by Judge Sarah Hughes, a federal judge in Texas, who wept with emotion as she administered the oath of office to the vice president by which he became the president of the United States. At the ceremony, Mrs. Johnson, who had accompanied the president on the tour of Texas, was there, as were various staff members, congressmen who were present, and all those with some official capacity or who could be brought into the ceremony. It's in the nature of things, of our presidential succession, that the emphasis, the spotlight, is now upon the new president. No one is ever prepared for an event of this kind. Not the Secret Service, which can only take the most effective precautions possible and can never safeguard against some twisted person who can circumvent the most careful precautions that can be taken. Not the public, certainly, not the officials of government. But the machinery for the succession to the presidency of the United States has been well tested over the years. And thus it was that less than 2 hours after the president's death, Vice President Johnson was sworn in the plane which brought the president to Texas and which took another president back to Washington, D.C. Also en route to Washington in the air is the president's body, accompanied by Mrs. Kennedy, who was in the same automobile with him when the assassin's bullet was fired in Texas, in Dallas, Texas this morning. We continue to have reports, fragmentary and confused still, as the law enforcement machinery in Texas on both the state, the city, and the federal level are engaged in trying to find the person or persons responsible for the bullet which was fired from the building which overlooked the route by which the cavalcade followed as the president, the governor of Texas, the vice president, Senator Yarborough, assorted dignitaries, moved from downtown Texas to a trade mart on the outskirts. A bulletin here from Dallas says that Governor John Connally of Texas, wounded by the sniper who assassinated President Kennedy, was described this afternoon as being in a very, very serious but not critical condition. Julian Reed, an aide to Governor Connally, said that Connally suffered 3 wounds, one in the right arm, one in the right leg, and one in the back that pierced his body. Julian said that Connally had been in surgery an hour and probably would be there for another hour. Now, for a report from our mobile unit in Chicago, we go to Chicago and Russ Bensley.
The flagstaff tells the story at the corner of State and Madison Streets. Beneath it, the bright lights, the Christmas demonstrations, but they have no joy today. Here in Chicago, the crowds who came downtown to shop are standing around in silence and sorrow in the rain. And the strange thing is, you don't even notice it's raining. And if you do notice, you don't care. Most of those who have talked to us here share the universal feeling of shock. Some have a feeling of anger. We thought we'd let you hear how they feel. Sir, how did the news of President Kennedy's death affect you?
As a man of God, I would say that I felt the impact of the sniper's bullet. I would also say that I felt the pain that the president had in his dying moments. Thank you.
You, sir?
I'm shocked, very shocked at this. We read about many countries losing their heads of government through assassination, but I never dreamed that it would ever happen to our head of government. I'm very sad indeed.
Thank you. How do you feel, sir?
It was once said that history repeats itself. Look at Abe Lincoln and John Wilkes Booth. The rain you see here in Chicago is not rain, it's emotion.
Sir, how do you feel?
Well, I feel shocked. I can hardly express my emotion, and I hope that the country will survive.
Ma'am?
I can't sit up.
Sir?
I just couldn't believe it when I heard it. We were in school. All of a sudden we were just told the president was dead. Didn't seem possible.
How do you feel now?
Like a daze. You don't know what's going on. Why? Why did it happen? Who would have done such a thing is the question.
Sir?
This is a dark day in the history of America. This man, I think, wanted to save America. He is not dead. His spirit lives. We are sorry, deeply moved over this incident here in America. I'm sorry.
I just can't believe it. I feel like someone in my own family is dead. I just can't believe it.
Feels like a loss in the own family, and I think it's a great loss to America.
Came up the street, and I thought, no, it's not true. We are not without our president. We live in a Christian country. President Kennedy was a Christian. Please God, help his wife, his family, give strength to his mother and his ailing father. We will miss a great friend and a true Christian.
We will all miss one of the greatest presidents that ever was. Thank you.
I was shocked when I heard it, and, well, they closed the city hall in respect to him. Everyone else is truly sorry it happened. And that's all.
Ma'am, how did the news affect you?
I was shocked, deeply shocked. We've lost a very good president. He was for the poor people, and that's what we need, a president like that.
Those are typical reactions in Chicago, and I imagine they're fairly typical.